Imagine with me a scenario. Try to imagine that you're traveling through the desert. It's hot, it's dry, it's dusty, and you've run out of water. Now, when I'm hiking and realize I have a long way to get back and it's hot and I don't have as much water as I'd like, makes me feel a bit of panic. So imagine you're going through the desert and you have a long way to go. Maybe you're walking, maybe you're on a horse with no name. But you come upon what looks like a water station and you see a pump. You know those old-fashioned pumps where you have to go like this to fill your container? So you're excited and you get your container out and you go to the pump and there's no water. And that would be very disappointing, but then you see there's a jar of water and a note. And the note says, "Don't drink this water. Pour it into the pump and you can have unlimited water." Now, what do? You're thirsty. You could drink that water and you'd be okay, or you could put the little bit of water in and fill up all your containers. And if you drink that water, you also would leave no recourse toward the next person. But you don't know who wrote the note or put the jar of water there. And so you don't know if you pour it in, if the pump is in fact going to work. I think that would be a hard choice. Because if you pour it in and it doesn't work, then that'd be very bad. But if you pour it in and it does work, then you'd be able to resupply and have more than enough water. So pouring it in would take a measure of faith in the pump that it's going to work. It's called when you do that, priming the pump. If anybody's ever had a pump and they're going like this and nothing is coming out, and I've done that on those types, you have to prime them if they've been sitting a little while for them to work. I've seen this in national parks sometimes where you have to pour it in order to make it work. Or electric pumps. You have to prime them for them to work, or else, I think we've all heard, maybe you heard from your dad, you don't run a pump dry, an electric pump, or it tends to burn up. I've had a few that are on a timer for a pool that it doesn't get primed, there's a little leak in the system, and then the motor burns up and you need a new pump. So in order to prime the pump in the desert setting, well, that takes faith. You have to give a little bit in order to give a whole lot more. We're going to look at a Bible story this morning that teaches us something about faith. 2 Kings chapter 4. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha. You ever get Elisha and Elijah mixed up? It's easy when you're reading the Bible. If you're reading straight through, it might be easy to keep track of them because Elisha gets a chariot that takes him to heaven and Elisha takes over the ministry. But then sometimes if you're just reading a Bible story or a devotional, it's hard to keep track of them because Elisha is Elijah's trainee and successor. Easy way to remember them is Elijah. He was older, and the Bible describes him as a very hairy man. And then Elisha, he's bald. So if you saw them at a party, it'd be easy to tell them apart. Kids remember things that way. Fast kids, you talk about Esau, they're like, oh, he's the red hairy baby. Red hairy baby guy. Yeah, that's him, and that's how he's described when he's born, as being very hairy, and also later in life when he comes for the blessing, his father Isaac's blind, and he wants to make sure it's the right son, so he wants to feel his arms. And it would have had to be a sight to see that Jacob, to get the blessing, had to attach like goat hide to his arms so he could feel like Esau. So that had to be something else. So, wife of the man from the company of prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take away my 2 boys as his slaves. One thing when I've taught finance to people, just in different settings, or explained it to people, there are basically 2 kinds of debt. When you borrow money, how does the creditor know that you're going to pay them back? If you loan money to somebody, how do you know that you're going to be able to get the money back? Well, usually you don't. Nowadays, we could run credit checks to see people's history of borrowing money and paying it back. But even today, as it was then, we have 2 kinds of debt: secured debt and non-secured debt. Now, the most common ways you can borrow money that's secured is by securing it with a lien on a house or a car. There are plenty of other things that can be secured debt that are business equipment and so forth. But it's common in real estate. When you take a real estate loan out, you secure it with the property, meaning that if you don't pay back your loan, you have a deed of trust in California or a mortgage in other states that allows the creditor to foreclose and sell the property in order that they may be paid back if they're not getting paid back. Or with the car, if you get a car loan, it's typically secured by the car, where if you don't make your car payments, the repo man comes out and repossesses your car and takes it. The car is then sold so that the creditor can get paid back. So secured debt, you get much lower rates than a personal loan from the bank that's not secured. But one thing that seems messed up in ancient history is you could secure loans with lots of things, a lot more than what we do. The Levitical law tells us, if somebody secures their loan, and they're poor, don't go take their jacket, and then they may freeze to death. So that seems like a good thing that we don't do that anymore. The price of garments has changed. I doubt you would get very much to get paid back for a used jacket. You could buy them a secondhand jacket fairly cheap, but people would put liens on their kids. It's one of those cultural issues that you see in the Bible, that, hey, I'd like to apply for a loan and I want a good rate. Okay, well, what kind of collateral do you have? Well, I don't really have anything, but, well, I do have Cameron or Christopher, that if I don't pay you back, you can take them as a slave. We'll do up a contract. And so you better kids, you better hope I can pay my debts. Um, Very strange to us. Common practice. I mean, we don't, I'm pretty sure that's illegal now. Um, Thank God that's illegal now. That, or you could collateral yourself as a slave in this time that, well, if I don't pay it back, I'll go ahead and become your slave. So she's saying that her husband died, who revered the Lord, and his creditor is coming to take my two boys as slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing at all, she said, except a little oil. So she had already had a garage sale. She'd already sold all that she had and was truly destitute. Now, maybe most of us, if not all of us, have been through a time in our lives where things were really tight. But that's extra tight when all you have is just a little bit of oil. You have nothing else. No table or chair to sell. No jewelry. No extra clothes. Not anything except for a little oil. And so she's going to the prophet because the prophet talks to God and gives words from the Lord, saying like, hey, does God care? Does God care about our struggles? Does God care what happens to us? You have to put yourself in her shoes for a minute. They didn't have bankruptcy then, that you could declare bankruptcy, go before a judge. Bankruptcy is where you show a judge that I have these debts and there are extenuating circumstances where I am unable to repay them. I have no means to repay them, and then often your credit's ruined, but the judge looks at what you can pay and the rest is usually written off. This gets abused sometimes. I've known people that, well, I have to declare bankruptcy, might as well go on a shopping spree and max my credit cards out. And we're lucky in our society that if our parents or relatives die, they owe money, it's paid out of the estate, and beyond that, we're not typically responsible. But in this widow's time, they were coming to take her children. And you can imagine, as a parent, how frightening that must have been. And women in the ancient Near East usually didn't have means to go out and get a job and make money. Oftentimes they might assist their husband in his work, but without a husband or a male relative, they were often destitute. Yet we see built into God's law and culture, in Levitical law, Exodus 21 says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. So slavery then was not perpetual and forever. But that might give you some comfort. If the repo man's coming to take Cameron and Christopher, I don't think Mary and I would find a whole lot of comfort in, well, it's only for 6 years, and then you can move back home. It's lousy. Wasn't supposed to be something punitive, but to restore what's owed. And you see deterrence for laziness. The Apostle Paul much later wrote, the one who steals must steal no longer, rather he must labor, doing good with his own hands so that he may share with anyone who has need. Deuteronomy 15 in the Old Covenant, 15 verse 12, it says, if a fellow Hebrew, a man or a woman, sells himself to you and serves you 6 years, in the 7th year he must let him go free. And when you release him, do not send him away empty-handed. Supply him liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to him as to the Lord, your God, who has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you. This is why I give you this command today. We see that God cares too. James 1:27, religion that our Father accepts is pure and faultless as this, to look after orphan and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted in the world. Or Leviticus 23:22, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. So if you farmed, you weren't supposed to pick everything clean, but leave a little bit there so that the poor could come into your fields and take some fruit or vegetables. That was what the law required. And so we see this. So the widow goes to Elisha. First of all, his name means my God saves. And she was desperately in need of saving, crying out to God. Elisha was the leader of what they called the school of prophets at the time. So somebody of some importance. This was the time, dated about 850 to 800 BC. In the Old Testament, it's when, if you've studied Western civilization, it's when Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. So, long time ago. He was called by Elijah and given his mantle while he was out plowing. Imagine that. You're farming, you're plowing your field, and the prophet comes up to you, puts his mantle on you, and says you're going to take his place. He became Elijah's servant, and when Elijah was getting ready to be carried to heaven, he gave a double portion to his successor. And the double portion is what you would give to your heir, your firstborn. So it would be if you had 3 kids, your estate would be divided 4 ways, not in thirds. The oldest would get double what everybody else got. So if you were dividing it evenly among your kids in 3, you would make it divided into 4 and give the oldest one 2 parts. And we see it wasn't always the oldest one. If the oldest one was not as competent, you might take a younger son, give him the double portion, and make him the main heir to your estate and what you have. So he becomes the headmaster of the school of prophets and ministered about 50 years in what was then the northern kingdom of Israel. So we see her kind of questioning, can you help me, and does God care about me? Then we see his reply in verse 3. Elisha said, go around and ask all of your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Notice that. That's something to note or underline or highlight. Go get empty jars and don't ask for just a few. He doesn't tell her why. But God's getting ready to do something. He's calling her to take a step of faith. Calling her to go out and prepare for God to act. This in a way is like having faith to prime the pump. Get more, and then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. So go out and get empty jars. We see instructions like this a lot of the time in the Bible of somebody being asked to go do something that doesn't always make a lot of sense. Sometimes it just seems like a test of obedience. Remember Naaman that came with leprosy, and it was told to go bathe in the river 7 times? And he was mad and offended, saying, I have leprosy, I have skin disease, and he has the nerve to tell me to go take a bath? Like he thinks I'm dirty, that's going to cure it? You think I'm not already? So, and the servant says to him, well, if he'd asked you to do something really elaborate and hard, wouldn't you do it? So why don't you give it a try? What have you got to lose? And he does it. And then some of Jesus' healings, saying, according to your faith, so it be done to you. And remember when he went to his hometown, and it says there he could do no miracles there because of their unbelief? See, here's a big part of the lesson. God requires a little bit of faith on our part for him to do something. And it's not that we do it, it's that God allows us to help. It's kind of like when your 4-year-old, you remember back when your 4-year-old son or your 4-year-old grandson or niece or nephew wants to help cook. Do they really help you? Does that really help you make dinner easier? No. But do you let them help because it brings them joy and blessing? Yeah, you're making a casserole and they can't do much. Certainly they can't cut the meat and cut the potatoes and handle the hot dish, but maybe you let them sprinkle the cheese on top. Maybe you let them scoop the flour and put it in. I think that's how God works with us. He lets us help so that we get a blessing out of being a part of it. But sometimes he requires that we do something. There are some parables to this. A common one I've heard in different sermons and settings is this: 2 farmers prayed for rain. One sat back and waited for it to happen, and the other went out and plowed his field to get ready for the rain. Which do you suppose had more faith? The one who went out and prepared for it and plowed, or the one who sat back and waited? That'll get you thinking for a little while. It seems the one that went out and prepared, the one that took a step of faith, had more faith. The one that took action. Now, it's not all just to say God helps them who helps themselves. That's a proverb some people say. It's not a Bible verse. Sometimes it's true. Not always, but definitely reminds us that sometimes we have a part to play in our expectation of God acting. Sometimes we gotta step out in faith like we're preparing that God's going to act. I remember I attended a college Bible study, college and young adult, and there was one guy that attended every week. I was probably my first 2 years of college. He was in graduate school working on a PhD. And so he was a little bit older, probably about 27. And one of the main things on his mind every week when we would pray together in a group was to say, like, I'm praying that God will bring me a wife. I think I'd like to get married and have kids and move on, and it just doesn't seem to be happening for me. And this went on for a long time, and we had many debates, me and a few others, of like, okay, so are you doing anything to get out there and date? Say, no, I need to have faith that God's going to bring me a wife. And then we debated back and forth. He said, well, if God wants me to have one when the time's right, he's going to bring you one. Well, how's he going to bring you one if you don't get out and meet people? You know, he was kind of shy. But I think you got to get out there and date. If you want a wife, you got to get out there and date. That's an act of faith. You got to get out there and like expect that you're going to find somebody. And he disagreed. He kept saying, no, God's going to bring me one. Do you think she's going to knock on your door? And we went around, I don't know, this just went on for like a couple of years. And we went around and around, you know, me and a few other people, and it seems like we were divided on this issue. Well, eventually his prayers were answered. He went back to Oklahoma to visit, and his mom set him up with somebody that she knew, and they hit it off and got married. So, hard to say who was right. God answered his prayer. I suppose he had a bit of faith to agree to go on the blind date, and things worked out. So Elijah says, go ask your neighbors for empty jars. Don't just ask for a few. Then she does it, comes back, gets all these jars, and then he says, go inside, shut the door behind you and your sons, pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. So we see that she has nothing. She's already sold it all. She just has a little bit of oil left. Nothing else. She left him, verse 5, and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. You know what I'm thinking if I was her? I think you're thinking that, well, I should have gone a little further to some further neighbors and got more and more jars. Because it never ran out till she'd filled up every last one of them. So I imagine she probably thought, well, I should have got more, because God's gonna fill what you have and you bring before him. And then that's all and no more. He replied, there's not a jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. How about for us? How many jars are you putting out there for God to fill? How big are your jars? You putting out shot glasses? Or putting out 5-gallon buckets to get filled out? This is a story of faith here. And then she went and told the man of God, hey, all the jars got filled up. I think he knew that. I think he knew how it was going to happen. And then he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. Now, I've met people nowadays, I don't know what it was then, but nowadays I've met people that grow olives and press them and make olive oil. Seem to be good money. Seem to be good money in it. Doing that is a good business. You might just be thinking of a little bit of cooking oil, but oh, it's a valuable commodity. So we see a principle here of God using what people already have and multiplying it. We see that example many times in the Bible. Start with what you have. Moses, for instance, God called him to be his spokesperson. God asked him when he objected to it. God said, "What do you have? What's in your hand?" He said, I just have this staff. Well, God used his staff. God used what Moses had. Or what about, here we see Elijah gave instructions one step at a time. She didn't get the end result. She didn't get the outcome. God calls us to take steps of faith, often just one step at a time, not knowing how it's going to end and where it's going to end up. It's frustrating sometimes, isn't it? We just wish we get the whole picture. But we see again and again in the Bible, God doesn't work that way. Elijah probably had heard the story from his mentor Elijah. Similar story. There's Elijah and the widow. She had nothing left. And he asks her to go home and cook him dinner with the last of what she has. Seemed to be a test, and she shared the last of her oil and flour with Elijah as a desperate act of faith, and then God blessed her for it. Jesus healed a blind man by putting by spitting in the mud, making a little bit of mud cake, it seemed, and then putting it on his eyes, and then going and telling him to wash in the pool of Siloam. You ever think about how strange that story is? He had to go to the right pool and wash it off in order to be healed. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In fact, try that. Find a blind guy and try that. I'll bet that'd probably be the most offensive thing that had ever happened to him. But this one, don't really try that unless God tells you to do it. But know that blind man had a lot of faith in Jesus to go do that, rather than, you kind of expect to see something like that and you expect him to cuss him out or something, right? If you really think about that story. Using what you have. Jesus feeding the 5,000. Just one boy out of one boy's lunch. One lunch pail. Few loaves and fish. 5,000 men. We estimate that it might be easily 3 times that amount if you start counting women and children, as it says 5,000 men. Now, if we're going to feed 50 or 60 of us with the potluck today, it's a lot of preparation. A lot of planning required. Turning water into wine. Jesus used what they had. What did they have? Well, pots of water. What are you going to do with that? That took a lot of faith for them to listen to Jesus. Fill the pots with water, now serve it to the guests as wine. It's a strange one. It's like, in a way, that what they were being asked to do could, if they didn't believe in him, could insult their intelligence. It's kind of like if I tell you, if you run out of ice, no problem, just you could just use some water and freeze it and make more ice. And it's like, that's kind of obvious. Yet we see these miracles results from God alone and His grace, doing something impossible, but He asked for participation in them. James 2:17 tells us in the same way, faith by itself that is not accompanied by action is dead. Or traditionally written and translated in English, faith without works is dead. Faith without action is no faith at all. But someone will say, you have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without your deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. Faith versus works. It's kind of like you can't dissect them very well. The purest faith calls for action to show that we trust God and accept this grace. For the widow, God makes things elaborate. In our way of looking at it, He might make it harder than it seems, giving people these tests. I mean, Elisha could have just had a gold coin and said, here, problem solved. Thank you, right? But that wouldn't have seen the miracle that happened. There could have been a lot of simpler ways. Somebody could have given her something. She could have found something under the rug, but God was waiting to do a miracle. How do you use what you have when there's limited resources? In Matthew 9:27, as Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying aloud, have mercy on us, Son of David. And when he entered the house, the blind men came to him and said to him, and Jesus said to them, do you believe that I am able to do this? They said to him, yes, Lord. This is speculative, but what would they have gotten of? I don't know. Maybe you can. Why don't you try? Would they have gotten their sight back? I don't know. I really don't know, but they wouldn't have. But they said, yes, Lord. And then 29, he touched and opened their eyes, saying, according to your faith, be it done to you. And their eyes were open. Rather amazing. So God allows us the privilege of participating. In fact, often requires it. I heard a story of a sailor that was involved in a shipwreck, and he clung to a piece of wreckage of the ship and ended up on a tropical island. Some natives found him, and well, he was glad to be rescued or saved. He didn't think he was out of the woods yet because he was afraid these natives were going to cook him in a pot. But instead, they put him on a throne and proclaimed him their king. Life was good. He was given the best house in the village, the best food, but as he started to learn their language, a darker side of things was revealed. He learned that every year the tribe would select a new king, and at the end of the year, they would put him on a remote neighboring island and leave them there where they would likely starve to death. So, awaiting his fate, he immediately ordered that a house be built on the island, and that a field be plowed and crops would be planted, as well as other homes constructed. And when the end of the year came, he enjoyed a comfortable retirement. Would you say he would have better faith if he'd done nothing and prayed, or prayed and prepared? Something for us all to think about. And we're going to close here. We'll have one more song, announcements, and a benediction. And as we close, I'll be up here during the last song if anybody would like to come forward for to pray with me about anything.